Hi, I'm Sharaad Kuttan, and welcome to Let's Talk, the show that brings you the most important conversation in art, culture, and ideas. And today we have the author of this book, Dismantling Global White Privilege, Equity for a Post-Western World. Chandran Nair is a new name in the Malaysian public sphere, though he's made some waves recently. But Chandran, many people might not actually know you. You have and worked overseas for many years and made your reputation, your professional reputation there. Tell us about yourself and how that feeds into the genesis of this book. I mean, you're the author of several books, in fact, but this latest book.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's kind of weird speaking without this. People can't see my gorgeous smile and my endearing qualities, but I'll try. Okay, so I am Malaysian. I was born in Central Pasar. I think it's called YTL City now. I went there last week and I couldn't recognize anything of the small kampung that I was born in. So then at about 20 years old, I left Malaysia, part and parcel of the unfair access to education in this country. I took advantage of the opportunity I had. I went and studied overseas. I was in London for about 8 years, and then I left for Africa. And I went to Africa to essentially understand development issues, inequality, and those things. So it was very much the genesis of, I like to think, what I am today, including my background in Malaysia.
Chandran, you're an engineer by profession or
Yes.
training?
Yes, I'm a biochemical engineer by training. So once I graduated from university in the UK, I had to pay all my debts because we didn't have enough money for all that. So I worked for 2 years in London, paid all my debts, got a work permit, but decided, and I think that was the start of all this awakening about what am I trying to do. Decided at that point, where most Malaysians thought to get a work permit and live in London was perhaps the height of success. I gave it all up and I went to Africa.
In South Africa in particular, or were you in many countries in Africa?
Yeah, at that time Malaysia, to its credit, was one of the few countries that didn't accept the apartheid regime. So I couldn't go and work in South Africa. So I went and essentially got a job with a voluntary agency next door to South Africa in a country called Swaziland. And it's in there that I traveled right across Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, and all of those. And Malaysians at that point with the Malaysian passport couldn't actually legally get into South Africa either. So what I did was, a couple of times, because I was in a band, I actually legally went across the border to South Africa, and that in those days, if you're caught, basically it's a foreigner timeout. So, but that was the time, and I got involved in the anti-apartheid movement.
This was in the 70s, the 80s?
This was in the 80s, at the height of the struggle. And then I got involved with quite a few members of the underground movement of the ANC, who were basically in different parts of Southern Africa, and Swaziland was. But the South African Defence Force, which was essentially the equivalent of the anti-terrorism agencies today, were essentially had a license to kill anyone that they thought were involved in agencies. So people like me provided covert cover for people who are constantly on the run.
Right, it's fascinating. You do, in fact, mention South Africa quite a bit in the book, and Oliver Tambo is mentioned in the book, and so on and so forth. I do want to ask you, if the South African experience in many ways shaped your sense of what race relations might be, and in its intricacies and its nuances. How important was that, and how formative was the South African experience?
Well, the South African experience was definitely formative in the sense that there was an armed struggle going on. South Africa, in a way, in terms of the armed struggle, was the least violent because of Nelson Mandela's view of a more pacifist approach. So, but I had many friends who were from Zimbabwe who were part of the ZANU-PF movement at that time. And that's why, I have a different view. And of course, Robert Mugabe morphed into someone who in the last 20 years has been ridiculed. But in Africa, in Southern Africa, Robert Mugabe is seen as a top leader of the black resistance. So, but the first experience of racism, and this comes back to Malaysia too, I felt was in the UK. Right? And then I felt, my God, how racist are these people? In Malaysia, as much as we lament the institutional racism that now exists, Malaysians are not racist to each other, and clearly as a Malaysian at that time, things have got worse in terms of the segregation in our communities and the politics. But Malaysians did not, I didn't go around a place, I was born in Sentul, and no one said to me, Kling balik rumah or something like this. We joked about Kling and Cina and Melayu and all that, and we were all brothers and sisters. But when to the UK, I mean, it was violence, not in terms of being people got shot down, but I remember in tube stations being attacked down the tubes by West Ham supporters who were all part of the National Front. I never confronted this.
Football hooligans, basically.
Football hooligans, and you didn't go out on a Saturday night in the East End of London because the fascists were all around, and I was, my God, this is terrible. And people were attacked by knives, etc. So I played hockey with Pakistanis and Indians who found this their home and were fighting this fight. And I soon realized this is a petty quarrel. I'm not involved in this. I'm leaving. There's a bigger fish to fry. I needed to understand, so I went to Africa to understand. And that's why I understood the geopolitics of race, economic dominance, etc.
Right, but your work has been, since that time, largely focused on the environment and sustainability. So how do you get from that and from decades working on sustainability to a discussion of white privilege and on a global scale? How do we make those connections?
I'm just trying to figure it out, but let me answer the question. So, when I left the UK, I was a biochemical engineer. I was doing work on ultra-pure water systems, etc., for nuclear reactors and things like that. And that's where my development consciousness said, well, this has got nothing to do with 99% of the world's population. I could get a cushy job, I could do this. But the real issues was to do with development. At that point, the UN had something called the UN Water Decade. It's got worse, by the way, 30 years later. And so I wanted to use my, my engineering knowledge, my little bit of science. I was still a young engineer, science-based biotech, and go and find out how you apply this to the real world, to the majority of people. So that's when I got into that. And so the political side, they're all connected because development is the other side of essentially what are the political, economic considerations, who makes decisions, etc. Then I got into this whole issue of the environment. I mean, the environmental movements, ideas, actually came from my roots in Malaysia. Being born in a place where the forests were lush, the mist, the rain. I was already beginning to figure out, thinking as a young person in Malaysia, as things were being developed, why was there so much destruction? Why weren't we preserving these things? So then the science and the training came into fore. I understood development. And then when I decided to leave Africa and come back to Asia to be closer to Malaysia, family, etc., I needed a serious job. I had no serious job, as I say, until I was about 30. And so I was headhunted to run a consulting firm in Hong Kong. I was in Bangkok. And long story short, it was a global firm. It had about 10 people then. And I grew it from about 10 to 500 people, opened 22 offices to our countries, including Malaysia. Was the first to open a consulting firm on sustainability and environment in China. And then I had the opportunity to get into all the technical areas of risk, sustainability, etc. And to just finish that off, after about 15 years of growing what is today the leading consulting firm throughout Asia, I got bored with the narrative. And that relates to this. The narrative about environment was not tethered yet to the idea of how economic development is still premised on what I call the East Asia-India company model. So once you start talking about sustainability, then you're starting talking about limits. But limits are not part of the narrative of the Western liberal economic system. And then I started speaking very much about it, and I felt I had to leave my consulting to further that agenda, which is then related back to the issue of who makes the decisions, where is the neoliberal narrative, and finally this book about white privilege.
Right, okay, so let me go to the forward, because the forward is actually fairly interesting in that it situates you in a lineage, in a 20th century lineage of analysis and critiques of imperialism, of colonialism, of the color bar, right? And so you can go back to W.E.B. Du Bois and up to Frantz Fanon, who you mentioned in your book. Also mentions the Bandung Conference. But I was very intrigued by this forward by Winnie Banyima, who is now the executive director of UNAIDS, former executive director of Oxfam. And the line that struck me, Chandran, was this. With the imposition of neoliberalism across the world, much of this conversation, this previous conversation about imperialism and the color bar, was silenced. Why did neoliberalism in particular have the power to silence what was a very important discussion all around the world, the decolonizing world? How is that possible?
Well, it's possible, and this is why my hopeful little contribution to the book. It was possible because when the collapse of the empire, the decolonization period from the 50s to 60s, Malaysia, 57, etc., started to happen, you have to understand, and I mentioned this in the book, of the capture of the mind. Our elites said, we want independence, we want you out, but my God, we want to be like you. So they had no terms of reference. They had no books. It's the same today. All you need is some Silicon Valley company coming here to talk to us about the disruptive economy, and all our elites will buy in because they have no ideas of their own. So when then the owners of that sort of narrative, the troops are out, we can't forcefully put troops down, but if we can manage essentially the ideological buy-in to our economic model, our belief systems, our culture, and our governance systems, and that governance systems discussion today is that big conflict between the West led by the United States and China. We cannot accept a plural system. Pluralism is out. It's only our way. So that's where the power came. It came actually from us, our leaders, our elites. They continue today to be subservient. So what do we do when we are wealthy? We send our kids to Harvard Business School and the Flat Earth Society, and they come back and they work with the investment banks here and they parrot the same old stuff. They have no ideas of their own, and yet we call them intelligent.
Okay, we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back, continue this conversation on Let's Talk. Stay tuned to Astro AWANI. Hi, and welcome back to Let's Talk. I'm Sharaad Kuttan, with me, Chandran Nair. He's the author of this book, Dismantling Global White Privilege. We've just been discussing the antecedents and the context in which this book was put together. And now we're going to have a deeper dive into the book. Chandran, thank you very much for laying the context for this book and the arguments in it. But tell us a little bit about the structure so that when people pick this book up, and I hope they do pick this book up, they'll have a better sense of how you're laying the groundwork for this argument that you're making about white privilege.
Yes. The first thing that people need to understand, and particularly, I'm at pains to point out to Western institutions and all my Western friends, this is not a rant against white people or Western institutions. This is not saying that all the ills of the world essentially arise from white privilege. We have our own ills, many of us our own making. But the overall architecture of the global order, as it's called, the rules-based order, is essentially based on Western institutions and therefore white people, and it permeates every aspect of our globalized world. So the structure of this book is based on essentially, well, the trigger for this was the George Floyd murder, etc., and then it sort of it translated into statues being taken down, etc. And several people said to me, what do you think of that? I said it's important. The fact that in the US and Europe, etc., people were buying into this is good. So it's a new generation coming up. But they're looking at the past. But what I wanted to say was actually, it's more than just the present in terms of football games and taking a knee, or why don't black actors get enough awards. That's a superficial discussion. What I want to then explain is it's woven into the entire fabric of our globalized world. Therefore, I break the book up into 9 chapters of what I call is white privilege, starting with geopolitics, the way we do business, the teaching of history, entertainment, even fashion, sports, and I get into the environment as well to explain how embedded it is. So even when we think about the environment, which I'm very, I like to think I know a bit about, the entire narrative about what is sustainability is a Western lens. Just let Jeffrey Sachs say something in the US, and all our elites here will listen. Get someone from China, India, or India or me to say something, and they're not interested. So what I'm doing on that part in my two previous books is to debunk the idea of sustainability as seen through the lens of Western experts. I don't believe they really understand, and that's in my second book, which is called The Sustainable State. So that's how the book is laid out.
Right. So let's look look at the environment, because there's a lot of talk about net zero and stuff like that. I mean, what are the key concepts, do you think, that are misleading, that are actually going to take us down a path where we are self-satisfied, but we don't actually do anything for the planet? That's the end game of your critique.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, and this is what I do through the Global Institute, and the narrative. Leadership in the 21st century is how do you do it? It's not about how you become a big CEO and sell, a million Starbucks coffees a day and say, I'm a great leader. Real leadership in the 21st century is not about talking about purpose in a meaningless way. It's tethered, in my view, to essentially the existential threat. So the pandemic has shown us that essentially we got into this mess through an economic model that is essentially at war with the natural world and with people, socially and essentially also in terms of their need to survive. So we have an economic model that's at war. The Western institutions are unwilling to accept this. I mean, that doesn't mean there are NGOs in the West, but they're on the fringe. But the main Western institutions that control the rules of globalization, the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD, and all, the WTO, etc., refuse to accept this. Because to accept this, in my argument, in my second book, The Sustainable State, is to say that we in the developing part of the world, who are the majority, 85% of the world, we need to accept a simple fact. 6 billion people in Asia in 2050 or 2060 cannot and should not aspire to live like Europeans or Americans. Game over. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to understand that. Yet, everything we do is to aspire to ape the economic models of the West through consumption. We need to redefine that.
And this is where neoliberalism comes in.
That's
because
right.
Exactly the promise of neoliberalism.
Everyone can have everything. And I'm saying uncomfortable truth. Everyone can't have everything. And your rights are not unfettered. So you don't have a right to 3 cars. That's what I'm saying, right? You don't even have, maybe you have a right to a car. You have a right to mobility, but not to 3 cars and a swimming pool in a semi-desert area because you're a billionaire. You don't have that right. Who institutes that? The Western liberal discussion is the free markets. Well, the markets have catastrophically failed everywhere, yet we just follow it. We need rules. And for rules, we need essentially strong institutions. The strong institutions are not McDonald's, Nike, or Microsoft. They're the institutions of the state. They're called the government. In fact, today and tomorrow, I've got 2 pieces in the FMT that argues that what the floods tell us, coming back, this is, the floods tell us that basically it is not an environmental event as such. It is essentially a failure of economic models. And that failure of economic models is underpinned by a failure of institutions in our country, which are not essentially, do not have the competence, not based on meritocracy, and is rent-seeking. So when you and there are different levels of rent-seeking, failure of meritocracy, etc., in different parts of the world. In our country, it is institutionalized. So the 21st century around the world will have to have a very different way of looking at things, and it's not the neoliberal Western worldview.
Okay, there are many parts of this book that I would love to go deeper into, but we're running out of time, and I want to ask you about. You can. In fact, we should have you back on the show again. But I just want to complete the argument, because what you do is you lay out the critique, and then you go on to say that we can, and I think the presumption here, the optimism of your book is that there is, in fact, a way to reverse this, whereas there are many people who are deeply pessimistic. Capitalism is not going to go away just because there is a critique. The critique is as old as, now 140 years, maybe with Karl Marx, right? So the issue really is, how do you change a system when it's not about people anymore? The system self-generates and expands. What is your prescription? What do you say in this book that turns the critique towards a kind of optimistic view of change rather than a rather pessimistic view that there is no resistance when it comes to the system?
Sure. I mean, this is, we don't have time, but I'll try and say this way. I get all the time accused of, there's no way forward, and in a way you're being...
You're accused of pessimism?
I'm accused of pessimism, and, but the first thing I say is that if you don't do something and you're not optimistic, then it's a very easy way to essentially relinquish any obligations. And this is essentially much of what elites do. Then you can be in denial. I can't do anything about this, right? So, but if we believe that change must happen, it's the only choice that we have, then we have to commit our efforts firstly to changing the narrative, the belief system. If a bunch of guys from the Heritage Foundation and rednecks could spread this simple, idiotic idea that everyone can be rich and we can live beyond our means in a period of about 50 years, I think we can do better. What we do have now, which is not what Marx and all had when they were writing their books over 100 years ago, clear evidence that this natural system is out of control. We also need to understand, just in the space of 200 years, the world's population has moved from 1 billion to 8. So please, if you're a policymaker, you need to understand that Malaysia's population has tripled since independence. Everything changes. So what I'm trying to do is embolden people to believe those ideas are part of the 20th century. In fact, they're the 19th century. We need to be smarter. And innovation is about deconstructing that and creating new models. And it starts with good governance.
Do you think it's persuasive? I'm wondering about, Malaysia, we've had a national car project that essentially peddled this idea that everybody should own a car.
We're not the only country.
Yeah, and we're not the only country, but it's a country where
all
this is... Right, so this is it, but it's an appealing one, right? Because people want things. If you're going to say to people, you should hold back on your wants, you should, in fact, not aspire to these material goods, what exactly are you going to put in its place that is going to be equally seductive or appealing?
Well, in terms of cars, just build the best public transport system in the world. I live in Hong Kong a lot. I don't have a car. My quality of life is not diminished at all. Some might say I'm privileged. I'm not, in terms of public transport, I'm not that privileged. I take the train, right? I take the bus. Why? The quality is first class. So the economic model of the automotive industry is essentially, we can all get rich, but it's actually not pandering simply to the need for people to drive, because there are other different ways, more efficient. Most people waste, 10 hours a week in a car here? Imagine you had the best public transport. I live in Hong Kong. I'm never late to a meeting. I take the MTR, right? A very good service. Imagine we had that here. So you have alternatives, but the vested interests will not change. Who can change them? Not themselves, the state. So I'm not saying that this will happen by magic. You need leadership, you need vision. But there's no substitute. I'll just give you one example to say we can change. And I'm going to use the example of China, right? So about 4 or 5 months ago, the Chinese government basically took a hard line on essentially the gaming industry, right? So, oh yeah, kids want to play games. Really? How many games should they be playing at the expense of the education and their well-being, right? So it's not a needs issue. There are many things people want. There's quite a lot of people who like to have a little drop of cocaine every other day. But we will not allow it. We will not allow people to drink and drive. It's not allowed, right? So there are many rules that actually keep most of our societies intact. But when it comes to the market, essentially those who own the instruments of power say, hey, that's an infringement on freedom. So the Chinese government said to all those companies, you would take down those games. Why? Because we seek to protect tens of millions of young children. Similarly, they did the same with the education online stuff, which was essentially running a parallel education system. Rich parents thought they needed both. No, they didn't need it. The state had to intervene in those things. So the question you've asked, and respectfully, is part of that mainstream thinking. We need this. Well, we don't, actually. Let's have alternative means of transport. Okay, so make it first class.
Okay, and I agree with that. In transport,
that's vision.
I understand the collective, the wisdom of, say, good transport and mobility is a principle. But when it comes to freedom, we might have much more of a debate, which is that, the draconian, and I'm using a word that's often used in the Western media.
All the time.
Yeah, the draconian decisions made by a centralized authority is not something that is necessarily a good thing, because they can go very wrong. But,
sure.
But I do want to, because this is a big conversation, yeah, Chandran, sure. We must have you back on the show, but I do want to ask you to kind of complete the sense of what this book is trying to communicate. Tell us, in a minute or so, what this book, Dismantling Global White Privilege, seeks to put out in the world, and why you want Malaysians to pick it up.
The reason I want Malaysians to pick it up and people in the developing world, I just did a similar interview like with a Nigerian TV station on Sunday. The main reason is most of us have been seduced into believing that modernity is somehow a Western, aping Western ideas. The food we eat, the way we dress, and for black people in Africa, straightening hair, and for Indians, whitening your skin, and for Koreans, shaving off your cheekbones. They're not shaving their cheekbones to look like you, me, or the Nigerian, to look like white people. So I'm trying to say to them, you're actually subservient. Your subservience is essentially a very dangerous thing, because in a blink of an eye, we're losing hundreds of thousands of years of knowledge and insights because you think Facebook has the answer. But it's not rebelling against the West. It's saying, have a bigger view, right? So people in Malaysia think, hey, you know, Malaysia is bad, I'm going to Australia. Well, there's no civilization there. I'm saying this on TV, right? There's no civilization there. But the Asians seek proximity to whiteness. So, you know, you got crazy rich Asians. There's nothing to do with Asian. It's rich people looking like, wanting to look like white people. So I'm not being nationalistic, not saying you need to be Asian. Open your eyes to what's going on in the world and have a wider worldview so you can absorb from the best of both worlds. And that's what I'm trying to say. The point I'm trying to make is there's an incredible torrent of information and disinformation to get Asians, Africans, people in the Middle East who are already subservient to the narrative to move further. And that's the roots of how, you know, going back 50 years ago, neoliberalism won. We were all adaptable, we were suppliant, we were conveniently exposed to those ideas. We never asked the question. I'm just asking the question and saying, think, what are you doing?
It's just fascinating. You part of a tradition that goes back to Tagore, also looking at a kind of Asian modernity, one that does not mimic the West, and trying to find the details of that, because we have struggled, I think, for many decades around what it means to be independent and to be kind of culturally sovereign. Thank you so much, Chandran, for your insights and also for being on the show. Thank you so much. I've been speaking to Chandran Nair. He is founder and CEO of Global Institute for Tomorrow, the author of this book, Dismantling Global White Privilege.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you on Let's Talk this week. I'm Sharaad Kuttan, only on Astro AWANI.